HOA thought they could control us until my father, a judge, showed them the law. They banned my family from visiting. They said we were destroying the neighborhood. They treated us like criminals in our own home. But what they didn't know is that the man sitting at our dinner table every night wasn't just my father. He was the one person who could end their power forever. And when he finally stood up, the entire HOA was left shaking because the law was no longer on their side. It was on ours. Welcome back to HOA Unit, where we share the darkest, pettiest, and most unbelievable HOA stories you'll ever hear. My name is Daniel. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood with perfect lawns and perfect fences. At least, that's what they want you to believe. But behind those white fences, the HOA was running this place like their own kingdom. And that's where my story begins. I thought this street was perfect when we moved here. The houses stood in perfect rows. The fences were all the same height. The grass never grew too tall. And the mailboxes lined up like soldiers. It looked like order. It looked like safety. It looked like the kind of place where families could finally rest. But I was wrong. Behind those perfect white fences was control. Behind every neighbor's smile was judgment. And behind every letter the HOA slipped into our mailbox was a warning. At first, I thought it was nothing, a letter about our trash can being visible from the street. A note about the garden hose not rolled tight enough. Small things, petty things, things that made me laugh in the beginning. But soon, it was not funny anymore. They started watching us. The neighbors peeked from their curtains. The HOA president, a woman who never smiled with her eyes. She stood outside and measured the grass. She checked who visited and how long they stayed. And slowly, she made it clear that this neighborhood was not mine, it was hers. I remember the first time she told me directly. She stood in front of my house with her clipboard. Her voice was calm, but her words were sharp. Your cousins cannot park in front of your house anymore. I asked why. She said it was the rule, but when I checked the rule book, it said nothing about it. That's when I realized they weren't following rules. They were making them every day. A new restriction every week. A new fine. Soon they said my aunt needed a visitor pass to come inside. Then they said my uncle could not visit because he drove a pickup truck. And then they banned my family altogether. Imagine that, your own family banned from visiting your home. The street that looked safe suddenly felt like a prison. And the guards wore pastel cardigans and polite smiles. I tried to ignore it, I told myself. It's just neighbors being picky. But deep inside, I was angry. No one had the right to tell me who I could welcome into my house. No one had the right to decide who my family was. But they thought they had that power. The HOA thought they could control me, control my family, control every single detail of my life. And the worst part, most of the neighbors went along with it. They nodded in meetings. They whispered when my relatives parked outside. They treated us like we were breaking some sacred law. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that the law was already sitting in my house every night. My father, he was quiet most of the time. He didn't argue with the neighbors. He didn't yell when letters arrived. He just read them, carefully, word by word. He didn't say much to me either. He only asked small questions. Did they send another notice? Did they say why this time? Do they give proof? I didn't understand then. But later, I realized he wasn't ignoring it. He was building something piece by piece, like a mob, and gathering stones before he builds a wall. And then one night, he looked at me across the dinner table. His eyes were calm, but his voice was heavy. They crossed the line, he said. I asked him what he meant. He pushed the latest HOA letter across the table. It said my family was no longer permitted to visit my home at all. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even for a single night. It wasn't just petty anymore. It was cruel. It was illegal. That's when my father told me the truth. He wasn't just my dad. He was a judge. and the HOA had just stepped into his courtroom. The next days felt unreal. The HOA sent more warnings. They smiled in public, but behind closed doors. I could feel their anger boiling. The president stood outside longer than usual. She tapped her pen on her clipboard when I walked by. She wanted me to be afraid, and I almost was, but then I looked at my father, calm, steady, silent, and I realized they had no idea what was coming, because in this neighborhood, the HOA thought they were the law, but soon they were going to learn the difference between rules and real justice. And that is where everything began to change. The night after my father told me who he really was, I could barely sleep. The house felt different. The walls seemed thinner, like the entire neighborhood was listening. I kept hearing the sound of papers moving in his study, the faint scratch of a pen, the steady rhythm of a man who was preparing for battle, but not with fists, with words, with law. The next morning, the president of the HOA stood outside again, her arms folded, her lips pressed tight. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was enough. It was her way of saying, I control this street. But for the first time, I didn't look away. I just stared back, and maybe she noticed something different in my eyes, because her smile flickered, just for a second, inside. My father spread the letters on the dining table, each O. Nay neat, each one stacked like evidence in a trial, warnings about grass, complaints about parking, threats about visitors, and finally, the paper that banned my family completely. He tapped it with his finger. This is the one, he said. They crossed into the law, and now the law will answer. I had never seen him like this before. He was always gentle, always calm, but now his voice carried weight, like the air itself was listening. The days that followed were tense. The neighbors smiled less. The HOA meetings grew sharper, and the letters became more aggressive. One note said our home was under special watch. Another claimed our relatives were disturbing community peace. And then a fine arrived. A fine so high it could pay for a year of groceries. I wanted to scream. I wanted to knock on every door and ask them, why? Why were they treating us like strangers in our own home? But my father stopped me. Let them keep writing, he said. Every word they put on paper becomes their chain. So I stayed quiet. I watched, and I learned. The president seemed more confident each day. She strutted at meetings, she waved her clipboard like a sword, and the board followed her lead. Every vote was unanimous, every decision in her favor. The neighborhood had become her stage, and she was the queen. But queens. Fall. One evening, we sat on the porch. The sun was sinking behind the perfect roofs, and my father finally leaned back in his chair. They believe they're untouchable, he said softly, but they forgot something. I asked him what. He smiled, but his eyes stayed sharp. They forgot the law is bigger than their rules. I didn't understand everything then, but I trusted him, and that trust gave me strength. The next week, the HOA delivered another letter. This one was bold. It said if my family continued to disrupt community standards, they would move to remove us from the neighborhood altogether. Eviction. From the house we bought with our own money. From the street where we paid our dues. From the place we called home. That night, my father placed the letter on the table. Then he pulled out something I had never seen before, a thick binder. Inside it were laws, real laws, county codes, housing rights, property statutes. He had been gathering them quietly, while the HOA thought they were winning. He turned the pages slowly, he marked them with his pen, and then he closed it with a sound that echoed in the room. They have no idea what's coming, he said. And that was the moment I knew the HOA had written their own sentence, and my father was ready to deliver it. But the strangest thing happened after that. The neighbors began to shift. Some of them avoided eye contact, some whispered apologies when no one was watching, and a few even slipped notes into our mailbox saying they were sorry. They had been afraid of the president too. That's when I realized it wasn't just about us. It was about the whole street. Everyone was living under her shadow. Everyone was trapped in her rules. We were just the first to fight back. The president didn't see it, though. She thought fear would keep everyone in line. She thought the threat of fines and notes and bans would silence us forever. But fear doesn't last forever. Not when truth is stronger. And my father carried the truth like a weapon no one could touch. So I waited, I watched, and I wondered. How long could she keep smiling? How long before her perfect little kingdom collapsed? Because when a judge decides to fight, it's not a battle you can win with a clipboard. The first time my father walked into an HOA meeting, the room changed. The air felt tighter. The board members shifted in their seats, and the president. She tried to smile, but her smile looked like glass ready to crack. She welcomed him politely, but her eyes said something else. Her eyes said, "You don't belong here." He didn't sit in the back like most homeowners. He walked straight to the front row. He carried no papers, no notes, just his presence, and somehow that was enough. The meeting began with the usual: complaints about grass being too long, warnings about trash bins, a fine for a neighbor whose flowers were the wrong color. The board laughed politely, like they enjoyed the sound of their own authority. Then it was our turn. The president cleared her throat. She read the letter about banning my family. Her voice was calm, but every word was poison. She said our visitors disturbed the peace. She said our family lowered property values. She said we were unfit for the neighborhood. People nodded, some out of agreement, some out of fear, some just because they didn't dare do anything else. And then my father stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He simply asked one question: under which law? The room went silent. The president blinked. She repeated herself louder, as if volume was law. But my father only asked again, "Under which law can you ban a man's family from his own home?" This time, no one answered. The board shuffled papers. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, and the president's smile vanished completely. I could feel the tension crawling up the walls for the first time. The HOA wasn't in control for the first time. Someone challenged them in their own arena. My father sat back down. He didn't need to argue. His silence was louder than her clipboard. The meeting ended faster than usual. The president avoided looking at him. The board members whispered to each other, and the neighbors. They looked at me differently, some with pity, some with curiosity, and some with hope. Because when one man asks the right question, it breaks the spell. But the HOA wasn't done, not by a long shot. The very next day, another letter arrived, this one more aggressive than all the others. It accused us of public defiance. It threatened higher fines. It warned of legal action from the board. I wanted to tear it to pieces, but my father just smiled. "Good," he said. "Now they've given me exactly what I needed." He added it to his binder, the binder that was growing thicker every day, a silent weapon waiting to be used. Meanwhile, the president grew bolder in public. She stood in her yard staring at our house. She whispered to neighbors when I walked past. She even stopped one of my relatives at the gate and told them they were not welcome. It was war now, not with fists, but with rules, with fear, with silence, and yet, behind her anger, I could see something else, a flicker of doubt, a shadow of fear, because deep down, she knew she had finally picked the wrong family. I remember one night. My father sat with me on the porch again. The crickets were loud, the air was heavy. He leaned forward and said, "Do you know why they fear me?" I shook my head. Because I don't play their game, he said. They write rules to control people. But rules are nothing without law, and the law is on our side. His words stayed with me. They gave me strength. But they also made me wonder, how far would the HOA go to protect their power? Would they push until the very end, or would they crumble the moment the law knocked on their door? The days grew colder, but the tension burned hotter. The neighbors stopped waving, the board stopped pretending, and the president. She watched our house like a hawk circling prey, but my father didn't flinch. He carried on with his quiet strength, and with every passing day, I knew the real battle hadn't even started yet. The night after that meeting, everything changed. The president was no longer hiding behind polite smiles. She had declared war. And now the whole neighborhood knew it. I woke up to whispers. Neighbors gathered near the mailboxes, pointing at our house. Children who waved at me, now pulled back when their parents glared. And by the time I walked to the end of the street, another letter was already waiting for me. This one was different, thicker, harsher, not typed politely like the others, but bold, underlined, almost angry in its tone. It said we were under community investigation. It claimed our family had disrupted neighborhood harmony, and it'd find us again. This time, more than before, my hands shook as I held it. The words felt less like rules and more like threats. I showed it to my father. He read it slowly, his face calm as always. Then he placed it carefully into his binder. "They're panicking," he said. "When people abuse power, they always overreach, and when they overreach, they break themselves." I wanted to believe him, but it was hard, because outside, it felt like the entire street was turning against us. The president didn't just stop at letters. She began holding special gatherings where she spoke loudly about our family. She called us troublemakers. She said we were bringing chaos, and she promised the board would restore order. Some neighbors clapped, some stayed silent, but silence, in a room like that, was as loud as agreement. Soon, we noticed cars driving slower past our house, strangers staring at us from their windows, and once, I found a note tucked under our doormat. It said, "Leave before we make you leave." That's when fear crept in. Real fear. Not of the rules, but of what came next. I wanted to pack up. I wanted to move away. But my father didn't bend. He sat in his chair every night, reading laws, writing notes, preparing quietly like a man sharpening a sword. And the more pressure they applied, the calmer he became. One evening I walked past his study. The binder was open, dozens of pages covered in his handwriting, dates, codes, violations by the HOA themselves. It hit me then, He wasn't just defending us, he was building a case to take down the entire board. But outside, things were only getting worse. The HOA sent inspectors to our property, men with clipboards measuring fences and driveways. They knocked on doors late at night. They even questioned our relatives when they tried to visit. Every move they made was designed to break us down, to make us feel powerless. But they didn't realize something. We were already beyond fear, and a man who has nothing left to fear is dangerous. The breaking point came one Sunday. We had family over for dinner. It was quiet, simple, just laughter and food in our own home. But halfway through the evening, the doorbell rang. The president stood there with 2 board members. She didn't even wait for an invitation. She stepped inside like she owned the place. And with her clipboard shaking in her hand, she announced that every person inside was in violation of community code. I will never forget the silence that followed. My father stood slowly from the table, his chair scraping the floor. He walked to the doorway, and for the first time, I saw fire in his eyes. He asked her one question. Are you prepared to defend this statement in court? The president froze. Her pen hovered. Her smile twitched. For a moment, I saw fear crack through her confidence, but she covered it quickly. We will take all necessary action, she hissed. Then she stormed out, her board members following like shadows. That night, my father closed his binder. He looked at me and said quietly, "It's time." I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I knew this. The HOA had gone too far, and now, they weren't just facing a homeowner, they were facing the law itself. The street outside was dark, the houses silent, but in that silence, I could feel something building, like a storm waiting to break, and when it broke, nothing in this neighborhood would ever be the same again. The morning after the president stormed into our home, the air in the neighborhood felt heavier. It was like every house was watching us, like every window held eyes behind the curtains. The silence was not peaceful anymore. It was sharp, waiting to cut. And then the letter came. This one wasn't like the others. It wasn't typed in cold, polite words. It was hand-delivered, stamped with the HOA seal in red. It said our home was in violation of community order. It demanded immediate payment of fines, and it warned that further action would be taken if we didn't comply. Further action. What did that even mean? Eviction, court, something worse. I held the paper in my hands and felt my chest burn with anger. But when I showed my father, he only smiled faintly. They've just signed their own end, he said. They don't even know it yet. That evening he pulled the thick binder from his desk, but this time, he didn't just add their letter. He laid out everything in order, every fine, every warning, every false claim, page after page. Stacked like evidence waiting for judgment. He looked at me across the table, his voice steady, his words heavy. They think this is about power. But this is about law, and the law doesn't bend for them. I wanted to believe him, but fear was still inside me. The neighbors had grown colder, the board was more aggressive, and the president walked around like a general preparing for war. She started calling emergency meetings. She spread rumors about us being lawbreakers. She even told children not to play near our yard. It wasn't just rules anymore. It was humiliation. It was exile. And yet, my father never raised his voice, never lost his calm. He carried himself like a storm contained in a single man, waiting for the right moment to break. That moment came sooner than I thought. The HOA called another community gathering, the biggest one yet. Almost every neighbor was there. The president stood at the front. With her clipboard, her eyes burning with triumph, she read out loud a motion to remove our family from the neighborhood. She claimed we were endangering community harmony. She said we had ignored rules repeatedly, and she demanded a vote. Hands began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, one by one. Neighbors lifted their arms, some with confidence, some with hesitation, some without even looking at us. My stomach sank. It felt like the whole street had turned against us. And then, my father stood. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply pulled the binder from under his arm and placed it on the table in front of the board. "This meeting is over," he said quietly. The president laughed bitterly. "You don't decide that," she snapped. But his eyes didn't move. "This meeting is over," he repeated, "because everything you have done is illegal." The room fell silent. Neighbors glanced at one another. The board members shifted uncomfortably. The president's face turned pale. My father opened the binder and began to read, one by one. He listed every violation the HOA had committed: false fines, unlawful restrictions, discrimination in writing, Abuse of authority beyond their charter, each word struck like a hammer, each page turned like a verdict, and with every sentence, the neighbor's eyes grew wider. The president tried to interrupt. She shouted about community rules, but my father silenced her with one question. "Do you want me to read the county law that proves you wrong?" She froze. Her lips trembled. Her clipboard hung useless in her hands. In that moment, the balance shifted. The neighbors who once nodded blindly now leaned closer to listen. The board members who once followed her now looked nervous. And I, for the first time, felt hope burn inside me. The president stammered something about taking legal action, but my father only smiled. "Please do," he said, "because I am ready." And with that, he closed the binder. The sound echoed through the room like a gavel in a courtroom. The meeting ended in chaos. Neighbors whispered, board members, "Avo." I did eye contact, and the president left in silence, her face red with rage. But I knew something had broken. The spell of fear she held over this street was cracking. That night, my father sat with me again. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't celebrate. He only said, "Power built on fear never lasts. It only takes one moment of truth to bring it down." I realized then the breaking point had come. The question was, what would collapse first, the HOA's power or the president herself, the day after that explosive meeting? The neighborhood didn't feel the same. The president wasn't strutting anymore. Her morning walks with the clipboard had stopped. The board members avoided us on the street, and the neighbors, they watched with curiosity instead of judgment. It was like the air itself had shifted, like everyone could sense that her grip was slipping, but the president wasn't finished. She still believed fear could save her, so she sent another letter. This one wasn't even polite. It demanded immediate compliance. It threatened lawsuits. It warned that if we didn't respect the authority of the HOA, they would take us to court themselves. I expected my father to be angry, but he wasn't. He actually chuckled as he read it. Then he folded it neatly and slid it into the binder. "This is perfect," he said. "They've just given me exactly what I need." I didn't understand at first. How could threats be perfect? But then he explained, they have no idea who they are dealing with. They think they can scare us with the word court. But court is my home, and the law is my weapon. The next morning, my father made a call. I only heard part of it. Legal terms, dates, county offices. When he hung up, he looked at me and simply said, "It's time we stop waiting. It's time they face the real law." That week, an official notice was sent, not from the HOA, but to the HOA. They were being summoned, not to one of their petty meetings, but to a county hearing. The irony made me smile. The same president who had once banned my family was now the one being called to explain herself. And when the day came, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. People stood in small groups at the end of driveways. Some looked nervous, some looked excited. But everyone knew something big was about to happen. The president walked out of her house like a queen heading into battle, clipboard in hand, chin high. But I saw her hands tremble. Even queens know when their throne is shaking. We drove in silence. My father calm, collected. His eyes focused like a man who already knew the ending. Inside the courthouse, the air was different. No clipped hedges, no white fences, no fake smiles. Here, power didn't come from clipboards. It came from truth. The board sat together, their papers stacked high. The president adjusted her glasses and whispered orders. But when my father stood, the room listened. He laid out the binder. He spoke with the weight of the law itself. Every false fine, every unlawful restriction, every violation of county code, one by one. He destroyed their case. The president tried to interrupt. She waved her clipboard like it was a sword. She said we were troublemakers. She said the rules gave her power, but my father's voice cut through her words like a blade. Rules are not laws, and you have broken the law again and again. The board members shifted, some lowered their eyes, and the neighbors who came to watch leaned closer, whispering to each other for the first time. The president had no control. She wasn't the one asking the questions. She wasn't the one demanding answers. She was the one being judged. And my father, he wasn't just defending us. He was showing the entire room that the HOA itself was guilty. The county officials listened carefully. They nodded as he presented evidence. They frowned as the president stumbled over her excuses, and when he finished, the silence was heavy, the gavel struck, and in that single sound, everything changed. The HOA had they overstepped their power. Their ban was void. Their fines were illegal. Their actions were unlawful. And the board was stripped of authority until further review. The president's face turned white. Her clipboard slipped from her hands for the first time. She looked small, not powerful, not untouchable, just small. We walked out of that courthouse quietly, but inside, I felt fire. I felt victory. I felt freedom. The same neighbors who once avoided us now looked at us with respect. Some even smiled. Some even whispered thank you, because they knew. My father hadn't just saved our family. He had saved them too. The president stayed behind, her shoulders heavy, her kingdom gone, and I realized the woman who thought she could control us had been undone by the very thing she underestimated most, the law. The days after the courthouse hearing felt strange, almost unreal. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. No letters, no warnings, no clipboard tapping at the end of the street. For the first time in years, we could breathe. But it wasn't just silence that changed. It was the way people looked at us. The same neighbors who once turned their backs when the president glared at us now waved. They stopped by to chat. They even invited us to their cookouts. It felt like the spell had been broken, the fear gone, and the president, she wasn't gone. But she was defeated. She still lived in her big corner house, but the blinds stayed closed. The lawn that was once perfectly trimmed grew messy. The clipboard vanished. I thought she might fight back. I thought she might call another meeting. But she didn't. The courthouse had taken her crown, and she knew it. Still, my father wasn't finished. He didn't want revenge. He wanted change, so he worked with the county. He reviewed the HOA charter line by line. He made sure the next election couldn't be manipulated, and when it came, the neighbors voted, not out of fear, but out of freedom. The president lost. Her allies lost. A new board stepped in, this time with people who actually cared about the community. Not about power, not about clipboards, not about controlling every mailbox and flower bed. I watched the difference unfold slowly. The endless rules stopped. The stupid fines vanished. Instead of threatening letters, neighbors got newsletters about block parties. Instead of fear, there was laughter. And me, I finally felt like I belonged. But the greatest moment came a few weeks later. I was walking past the old president's house. She was outside, standing on her porch. No clipboard in sight. Her eyes met mine. For a second, I thought she'd look angry. But she didn't. She looked tired, and maybe, just maybe, a little ashamed. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. Her silence was louder than all the threats she ever wrote. That night, I sat with my father on the porch. The air was calm, the street was peaceful, and he said something I'll never forget. Power built on fear never lasts, but justice. Justice leaves a mark forever. I thought about everything we had gone through, the letters, the fines, the bans, the courtroom battle, and now, the quiet victory. We hadn't just won against the HOA, we had changed the neighborhood. We had taken away fear and given people their voices back sometimes. I wondered what would have happened if my father wasn't a judge. Would we have been crushed? Would the president still rule this street with her clipboard? But then I realized the real reason we won wasn't because of his title. It was because he refused to be silent. Because he refused to bow to fear, that was the lesson. The law was his weapon. But courage was the real victory as I looked down the street that night. I couldn't help but smile. The HOA thought they could control us, but in the end, we showed them that no one is above the law, not even the queen of the cul-de-sac. And now, every time I see neighbors planting flowers without worrying about color violations, or kids riding bikes without hearing safety fines, or families sitting together on porches without fear of being reported, I know we did the right thing, and maybe, just maybe, this neighborhood finally feels like home.